But also, we know Hamilton to be a little bit over the top.
Dramatic is the word you want to use. Dramatic.
I'm trying to be unbiased.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Grid. This is episode 9 of Grid Gals. Today we're going to be recapping the first of 2 Italian Grand Prix. This past weekend was the Imola race, and we, as we mentioned in our last podcast, just took a trip to Spain. Unfortunately, did not score a quick flight and some tickets to actually attend in person, although we wish we could have. And thankfully we have Mary back on the podcast today.
Yes, thank you. It's good to be back. It's good to be no longer infectious. Not that I ever really lost my voice, but did not want to get my fellow gals sick, so took myself out of the rotation for a couple weeks, but glad to be back. Yeah, so I think Imola was a pretty spicy weekend for a couple of reasons. First of all, weather. We saw rain on and off throughout the weekend. We dealt with some wet conditions here and there. Tires definitely played a factor in this weekend and how well people could react to the weather. And it was the first sprint race of the season. So good to see the sprints back. I mean, and we can get to that when we get there, but especially considering how qualifying went, I'm glad it was a sprint race. I think it made Sunday that much more exciting.
Yeah, and it was interesting to see all the changes that they've made to the sprint races. With all the new points given out.
I like the points. I think it's more intuitive, where even during the race, I know the first couple of places, but I don't necessarily, off the top of my head, know every step down.
Right.
Where, for the sprint race, it's super easy.
Yep.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Yeah.
I don't know why they picked 8. I wonder how they came up with that in terms of the calculation for the overall championship and why they decided 8 points and only the first 8 places score. But we should look into that. We can do a deep dive one of our off weeks.
Into the sprint races. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'll be fun.
Because it seems like a very random number. I would have assumed like they would at least follow suit with the top 10, but shakes it up a little bit.
Yeah.
Shorter race, shorter amount of point scorers.
I always love a good sprint race. I think it's exciting to have almost like a pre-race to the actual race, and it was no shock that Red Bull did well in the sprint, knowing that they've really seen issues typically further on the race so far this season, so I think this was a great opportunity for them to shine.
Well, before we get into the sprint, we want to talk through qualifying a little bit?
Yeah, because qualifying was really exciting. There's 5 red flags. So a lot of people were crashing.
Yeah, and I think there were some major disappointments. So first of all, would like to apologize to all of our Mercedes fans. I know we can be a little critical of Mercedes here on this podcast, but definitely feeling your pain since it was the first time in, I think, almost 10 years that neither Mercedes made it to Q3, which that's a little tough to watch.
Yeah, but I think Russell made up for it, and we'll talk about it later in sprint in the race. It was mainly just Hamilton, and the commentators were rough on Hamilton.
Absolutely brutal.
I even was kind of cringing, and I'm not obviously the biggest Hamilton supporter.
Saying a lot coming from you.
Yeah, and they were doing a lot of camera work, but we can talk about that when we talk about the race.
It seems like Hamilton was being emotional in some of the decisions he was making.
Yeah, and if you watch any of his interviews, he was super deflated throughout the entire weekend, which I think we saw in his performance, or I don't know what caused what, but there was definitely a different Hamilton at this weekend.
I think the other big disappointment, honestly, in qualifying was AlphaTauri, especially knowing they're an Italian team. And, first of all, I'll defer to the Tsunoda fan in a second. But, I think Gasly so far has performed really well this season, really well last season.
Yeah.
You know, and Sonoda's grown as well, and to have both of them perform so poorly, I think, was a little surprising.
You know, my most disappointing driver of qualifying was actually Sainz. And I'm a pretty big Sainz fan as well.
Yeah.
And I think what we saw was he's just getting way too into his head, and I thought he would actually have a really good weekend, knowing that he just signed an extended contract with Ferrari, but he was the second red flag after Albon's brakes caught on fire. I'm not really sure what's happening with him. I think it might just be it's all in his head. It doesn't seem like it's the car with Leclerc doing so well.
No, and I mean, even before he crashed, like, he was really comfortably in P2. And he was doing really well. He was on pace for another great lap. And I think he even said in an interview, he just pushed too hard.
Yeah.
I think you're kind of right. I think he's in his head and he wants it so bad.
Yeah.
To the point where, yeah, he just pushes too hard. And that was definitely a disappointment. I mean, granted, still made it through to Q2, but...
Right. Because he had one of the fastest laps before he crashed.
Yeah. That was... Especially considering he's on my fantasy team.
Yeah.
I'm glad I finally took the turbo off of him. I forgot last race. And, I mean, I know I didn't, but we already talked about Australia on this. Anyway, long story short, my fantasy team is not doing hot.
Yeah, you can tell he really hasn't been himself. And so hopefully he can get, some clarity with the off week coming up. And
I mean, I think we've also seen other drivers kind of struggle with the mental game, and hopefully it's something that you can get over and it doesn't plague your whole season and just get back on track.
And this weekend especially is so much pressure for the entire Ferrari team.
Oh, absolutely. Being in Italy and with how well they have been performing, I think there's a lot more expectations. Like, everything up until this point has been a pleasant surprise because even for most Ferrari fans, I mean, you spoke about it, Mary, on our predictions. Like, you had high hopes, but probably not. The first part of the season probably hasn't played out to what your expectations were. So especially going into this weekend, like, having Ferrari being in such a good spot, I'm sure there was a lot of pressure on him. Yeah,
I mean, Ferrari is doing so well this year compared to where they have been. It's Ferrari's home race. He just signed the contract. Like, you would think everything... and he did really well, had a great lap. Like, you'd think he's just primed for success, but, I think that's where the mental game really comes into play.
Yeah.
And makes the race outcome that much more heartbreaking. We'll get there, but God. It was a hard week to be a Ferrari fan.
It really was. But to round off qualifying, had a couple more red flags. So we had K-Mag, went off. Was able to get back on track, though.
Honestly, pretty impressive.
Yeah.
How he was able to get that car out of the gravel, too.
Yeah.
Pretty quickly.
And then Bottas' car just stopped, which is really disappointing, also for my fantasy. But he ended up, we'll talk about later, but he ended up doing pretty well in the race.
I think the other one that wasn't a red flag, but did come up in qualifying, Esteban Ocon had issues. I think it was with his gearbox.
Yeah.
And so he was out and actually ended up starting at not the back of the grid because Albon crashed. So he had an issue with, I think it was the brakes, something was rubbing. Actually, something exploded. His car caught on fire. Yeah. And he was able to actually, surprisingly, pilot that car back to the pits.
Whether he should have or not.
Yeah, spewing debris all over the track, but made it back to the pits. So Albon, because of that, started at the back of the grid for the sprint, but Ocon was 19 because of the gearbox issue.
Yep. And then the last flag was Norris.
Yeah.
Because he spun out. So it was a weird qualifying because there's so many red flags. I feel like it was such a hard time to get a good lap.
Well, and I think this is really where weather started to come in too, because, you're trying to time it with the weather, and I think we even saw at the end of Q2, everyone who was going to be dropped, including the Mercedes, basically decided with the rain, didn't even want to risk it to go out and try to improve. And then we saw people who knew they were going to progress to Q3 actually change tires and go out and just try to gather more data before Q3, which was really weird.
That was super cool.
Yeah, and it was, I mean, with the sprint race, you only have one practice before qualifying, and so with a wet practice and then a somewhat dry qualifying, they were talking about how quali was really like a one-shot game.
Right, because they had been practicing on a wet track, and then qualifying was almost completely dry. I think the track was still damp.
Yeah, so all the data they had kind of meant nothing. And so it was kind of funny at the end of Q2, you see everyone who's progressing go out, not to actually like get any flying laps in or anything, just collect more data and really use the time to prep for Q3. Which I don't think we've ever, at least since I've been watching.
Yeah, I've never seen.
But interesting from a strategic perspective.
The other thing that's changed this year, no more wreaths.
Yeah.
They gave out medals this time.
To be fair, I think that might have only been one race. I don't know if they did wreaths at all of the sprints.
Oh, okay.
I think just the first one we saw had wreaths, and I lost my shit.
I think it stuck with me, yeah.
Yeah.
Because they look so awkward.
They looked ridiculous.
That makes a lot of sense because I didn't watch the first sprint race last year, and then we talked about sprint races, and I was so confused when you were talking about how they got wreaths because I did not remember seeing that. So that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, no, I was looking back at some of the pictures, and I'm like, yeah, I think they only did it for one, but it still looked completely ridiculous.
Yeah, I'm glad they did not start it off like that again.
I kind of love it, though.
I mean, what isn't over the top about this sport?
Yeah, like, just be extra. You are already...
It fits. It feels right.
Yeah, agreed. So speaking of the sprint race...
Yeah.
I'm surprised you haven't said anything about who got pole.
I mean, it was a Max-dominated weekend. It was! You can't deny it.
For those of you listening, that's me aggressively rolling my eyes that she's responding to.
If it were Hamilton, you'd have to say it too.
No, it definitely was. I mean, Max and Red Bull.
Red Bull in general, yeah.
Overall.
Perez did really well. But Max getting qualifying, pole, sprint, first, so collecting 8 points there, and then, spoiler, winning the race.
Yeah.
I think it's funny because we were talking about we were recapping the Australian Grand Prix, you were expressing some of your concerns about Red Bull's status currently in the season, and this is a great example of how quickly things can change.
Yeah.
Like, a couple races where you make a few mistakes, and I think there were some mistakes that Ferrari made in this race that, you know, not that saying that he's completely caught up, but it's a marathon, not a sprint, and still very early in the season. So great to see for you, Catherine, being empathetic to your cause here. Great weekend for you all around. I think this is something to celebrate for Red Bull fans.
Yeah. Well, on the other side, though, I feel bad for your team here. I don't know if you watched any of the practice, but Daniel had gearbox issues third practice before sprint. So I don't know if that played into his performance after qualifying, because he did qualify pretty well.
He did. Like, him and, Norris was up in third, but, like, still, compared to what Daniel has done this season, qualifying in sixth is pretty great.
Yeah.
And I think he's still running off some of the momentum from the Australian Grand Prix. It felt like he got back, getting finally into the points, getting back some of his groove. But I think that fits, just knowing how Norris has performed so far this season and knowing Norris's performance last season too. It was a great weekend for him, but yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say sometimes with him whether it's the car or just his mental game.
Yeah, and I think the sprint was interesting because we saw a lot of place changes overall that really shook up the grid for Sunday. As we spoke about earlier, with Carlos Sainz crashing during qualifying, he started P10, and he really did a great job of fighting his way up the grid.
Yeah, back to fourth.
Mm-hmm. And same with Perez, because Perez started, I think, P7.
And I think a lot of that had to do with all the red flags.
Yeah.
So a lot of cars didn't get to go out there and get the laps that they should have.
Yeah, I think the weather was definitely tricky, but
it was a great time to have a sprint race for that reason.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of equalizes the weather factor, almost.
But the sprint was almost just as eventful. Still a lap one issue, so we had Gasly turn into Zhou, and Zhou was out of the race. Gasly was actually able to keep going, but super disappointing for Zhou because he's been doing super well. And then Jack, I don't know if you noticed, but in the sprint race, we had a black and white flag.
Oh, so glad that you quizzed me on flags. So thankful for that knowledge.
You know, it was actually really funny when I was watching it and I heard the announcement about the black and white flag. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I will admit this. Even as a gal, I was not a part of that episode because I was infectious human waste. But I did not know that. Like, Jack, not just you, I definitely didn't know what that meant. And when I saw it come out for K-Mag,
Yeah.
I was like, oh my god, wait, I know that one now. So, anyway, plug. Listen to this podcast. Makes you smarter. Makes you a better fan.
But that, I mean, it was.
Sure does.
I was surprised to see it. I thought they weren't really going to be using them after Massey left, and then.
Well, it was interesting because they said, and I mean, I saw it was really blatant. Like, K-Mag was definitely swerving, for sure.
Leaving, yeah.
It was the flag was well deserved, and I love K-Mag, but still. But they said, who was it? Someone else did that and got a 5-second penalty, and he just got a flag.
Yeah.
So, shout out the flag, I guess. Because
Yeah, definitely better than a 5-second time penalty.
And K-Mag had a pretty good weekend, all things considered.
Yeah.
Running in a Haas.
Of course, yeah. There's only so much you can do in Haas.
Which, okay, no hate for our fellow American team. Haas is actually, I've been really impressed with them this year. I think they're doing very well. I think the fact that he qualified P4, I'm not sure we said that.
Which is the highest that Haas has ever qualified.
Yeah, so we'll take a second.
Yeah.
Claps for Haas. Woo. Although, we won't, when we get into the race, though, you have to call out kind of mixed performance there. Like, it's crazy some of the discrepancy between how he's performing compared to K-Mag.
Well, in this, oh, yeah, Schumacher for sure. But I think in the sprint it was interesting because K-Mag started on mediums, where almost everybody ran the sprint on softs.
I didn't notice that.
And I think that Haas really thought there was going to be more of a drop-off in tire performance from everybody else, and they'd be able to pick it up at the end. Mm-hmm. And I really kind of think they missed the mark on that.
Yeah, we saw a lot of strategies go wrong this weekend.
Especially with tires.
Yeah.
So many.
I think
and so many experienced drivers, too.
Yeah, because I think they're still really trying to figure out this new compound. Because it almost seems like a lot of the drivers prefer the mediums over the softs even, which I feel like last year everyone preferred the softs.
Well, and then you add in the weather, too, because I think that was the weird thing about the race, is it was damp enough on the track that everybody started on inters, and they thought there was going to be rain, like 20 or 30 minutes into the race. Mm-hmm. And as they kept racing, the chances of rain started to dissipate as the track was starting to dry out. And so eventually you had a pretty dry racing line to the point where the inters were actually degrading enough that they were like almost becoming slicks.
And they were moving to the wet line, which is so unusual. You never see that.
Like drivers seeking out wet pavement to try and make their inters last longer. And then
to cool them down.
Yeah. They finally, I think Ricardo actually led the way to go in for slicks and got some mediums on. And then immediately, once they saw he was performing well, getting purple segments, everybody else is diving in and putting on their mediums. And then it's hilarious because the track is still wet. The only thing that's dry is the racing line. Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to overtaking...
it's hard.
Yeah, and I think we saw that Stroll, tried to overtake, I think it was Tsunoda. Mm-hmm. And you kind of can't overtake because as soon as you try to get off that dry racing line... I mean, he was throwing up crazy spray. I almost couldn't even believe how much spray was still on the track.
Right.
Because the racing line was so dry, you forget how wet the rest of the track is.
It was definitely a difficult drive for all the drivers, and a lot of strategy behind when you can pass and what corners, just based on what part of the track is dry enough to do so.
Yeah, and I mean, it did not rain the rest of the race.
Yeah.
But like that was a gamble in and of itself because
the entire time they said it was going to rain.
Yeah, and had everybody, I think that's why people held on the Inter so long, had you switched to slicks and then it rains, like we saw that in Russia last year. You're gonna pay for that really fast.
Right.
Yeah, just a really interesting weather strategy race.
Mm-hmm. And I think from some of the strategy, that's where you saw some of the decisions from Hamilton go wrong. Like, his team kept telling him to pit, and at that point, he really didn't have anything to lose. He should have picked the strategy that was alternate to the people that were further up in the places than he was. And you saw his team trying to encourage him to come in, and he just... That's where I think you see some of the emotional decisions on, no, like, I'm staying out here. I'm not pitting now to switch.
Which is really surprising because I think he was running down in, 14th while George is up in 6th at that point.
Right.
Like, why would you not?
And that's why I can only think it has to be him just, being emotional about it, or not, maybe just being so angry maybe at himself or just the situation. Because also, too, when he finally did pit, I literally gasped out loud, which I watched this by myself, but he almost crashed with Ocon. He had to, and it sounds like it was Ocon's fault, but still, it was just, I couldn't believe it. First of all, he's ignoring the signs from his engineers. Hey, you should pit, change tires, yada yada yada. And then he almost has a crash in the pit lane.
Which,
of all places.
I feel like that's how you can tell he's so not used to running in the midfield.
Yes.
Because I feel like when you're a race leader or you're fighting for the race lead, when you pit, there's almost... Okay, correct me if I'm wrong here. I feel like there's never traffic in the pit lane when a race leader's pitting. They're always really strategic about the timing of pitting them so they don't lose track position.
Because they're in a race of their own.
Yeah. And so I feel like Hamilton's also just not used to, pitting with people around him.
I agree. Well, in Hamilton's defense, which is, this is rarely going to come from my mouth.
Wow,
twice today.
Mark it down.
Mercedes was talking about how they did not build a car to run in the midfield. It's not meant to have all this dirty air. So this car is just not built to follow other cars like that in the midfield. I think that's why Russell's been doing well, because he's not following a lot of people closely. But if he qualifies well, then he's up there. But otherwise, if you're stuck in the midfield, you're stuck in the midfield.
It's very interesting.
Especially because you'd think that, Hamilton would be able to qualify well.
Yeah, I also think that's another issue.
I mean, again, talk about mental game. I think he's so off, and you could see it in the interviews this weekend. He was sounding defeated after quali. Even before the sprint race, he basically was like, we're a midfield team, we're not even fighting for the championship, and I think the commentators even remarked on that.
They said he had complete resignation, which is just brutal. And Hamilton even said he's not even thinking about the championship this year. But also, we know Hamilton to be a little bit over the top.
Dramatic is the word you want to use. Dramatic.
I'm trying to be unbiased.
I mean, hey, to give you credit, you've backed up Hamilton multiple times this episode alone.
I did see a rumor, and I don't know if this is a confirmed rumor, where he was commenting on switching teams. I don't know if this was just something that someone was trying to spread, or he said an off comment, but he was like, there was rumors saying that Hamilton was seeking out a new car.
We're definitely going to have to do an episode on driver changes, and I feel like we can discuss that then too, because that would be interesting to map out where he could even go with what contracts are up in the next couple of years.
Yeah, it's probably one of those things where he's just heated in the moment and fed up with the situation he's in, and clearly...
Or who knows, maybe it's like our girl Lizzo said, all the rumors are true.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, I'm done. Put me down.
No, I mean, Hamilton had a rough weekend and people were pretty brutal about it. So, Helmut Marko even had a comment where he said that Hamilton should have retired last year. And then, when you're watching the race...
Oh my god.
And everyone's just really reaming Hamilton for getting passed by Verstappen. Because Verstappen was race leader, he was lapping everybody, and finally it came to Hamilton. And... they were doing up-close video on Toto and then going over to Christian Horner. They're building the drama, and I feel like that just really...
I feel like that's where you can tell, the existence of Drive to Survive is... I'm not saying, affecting everything, but it's definitely, I feel like, affecting how the TV crews capture each race now. Mm-hmm. for example, Will Buxton, one of the most well-known F1 journalists. He's prominently featured on Drive to Survive. He's one of Sky Sports' major commentators for the race. And, so I think, it definitely has impacted how race weekends are covered.
Oh, I'm sure. Especially because there's so much more attention. So the drivers are followed around by so many more fans.
So I think it plays up, like you were saying, like Max passing Hamilton. Well, because of last season, yeah, obviously you're going to want to play up that angle. But if you look at it in the context of this season, Lewis is not particularly competitive. Like, Max is passing some midfield driver.
Right.
Like, why are we spending so much time on that? But, understandably, it's Lewis Hamilton. They had an insane rivalry. Last season was insane, and it was so dramatized.
And I'm sure it was just as bitter for Hamilton. I'm sure
Yeah.
it wasn't just someone passing him. It was who he was battling with all last year.
Yeah, I'm sure it hurts a little less when Charles Leclerc passes, but it still doesn't feel great.
I'm sure, yeah.
It's like how the turntables have turned.
Absolutely.
Well, and speaking of turntables and Charles Leclerc, absolutely heartbreaking.
He got too greedy.
Yeah, I think
the
it was
pressure
also
got to him. I think the same thing that happened to Sainz happened to him, where he was pushing too hard, and he even said that in his interview too.
Yeah.
And then he messed it up.
Yeah, and it was just so hard to watch because also it's not like it was a race-ending thing. He still scored points. He was able to make up a couple of places. Mm-hmm. It was just too late in the race to fully recover from it. And I mean, he clearly did some damage to the car. He hit the wall, but not enough that he had to go in and pit. So he lost a couple more places, but ultimately just not enough time to make it up. However, Jacqueline, disappointing for us Ferrari fans, but ultimately, well,
half happy for McLaren.
Yeah.
Did Ricciardo end up in last?
Yeah, he ended up completing the race, and last place. So, I mean, you could definitely see in the post-race interviews he was shaken, but very happy for Norris. I think he was very supportive of Norris's victory, and a great first podium of the season for Lando. Starting to feel like some McLaren momentum coming into the spotlight here. So I think this bodes well for the next couple of races and very exciting for him. And I hope that we continue to see more results like this from him.
Yeah, it was great to see McLaren really improve over the past couple weeks. And even Lando said that he thinks that they have the third fastest car out on the grid.
I mean, it's definitely seeming that way from the last couple of races at least. I mean, if we exclude maybe the first two races of the season, but
they really turned it around.
They definitely turned it around. I also loved the heartwarming moment at the end where Lando had found out that he made P3, he was going to be on the podium, and I think it was one of his main engineers, it was his mom's birthday, and he sang happy birthday to her, which was so cute. So if you haven't seen it, I know they posted it on the F1 Instagram, and obviously it's all over McLaren's feed, but Lando was obviously ecstatic about the win and very happy to cheer on one of his teammates' family members, so that was really cute.
That was cute.
It's always good to see McLaren score some points, We can't have our girl Jack getting too sad over there.
Yeah, definitely.
It was a mixed weekend for McLaren.
Yeah, it's hard because Daniel's so sad, but I mean, I'm really glad that Lando is starting to feel like he has a car that can compete and really able to show some of his talent there. I'll take what I can get. Beggars can't be choosers.
And hey, I think if it hadn't been for the Turn 1 incident, I think Daniel would have performed really well this weekend.
Agreed.
I think so too. And it's sad and unfortunate that it's two of our, or at least my favorite drivers. I think most of us really, or
the gals love those boys.
The gals support Ricciardo and Sainz, so it's hard that, the incident on the first lap involved both of them. So hopefully they can both shake it off. We see Sainz recover from some of his struggles the past two races,
but not too much.
Okay.
No, a lot.
I think on this side of the table we're in the let's see these boys recover.
We want the red team domination, not the Red Bull domination.
Ooh! Both of you guys team up.
Grow up! Your boy won a world championship.
Well, speaking of heartwarming moments, I thought it was super cute when Max and Checo came out together to take the podium, 1 and 2. The perfect way to end a great weekend for Red Bull.
It has been a while since we've seen a Red Bull 1-2 podium. I think a couple years.
You know what? And honestly, again, this is coming from the Ferrari fan, but you don't want to see anyone run away with the championship. You want to keep the season interesting, especially this year. You know, the whole point was to keep things close. And I think as tough as it was at Ferrari's home race to see Sainz knocked out lap 1 and, you know, to see the incident with Charles, like, so near the end of the race when he was running so well, I think in the long term, it will keep the championship fight more interesting, or at least that's what I'm telling myself, so that I'm not so sad. Thanks, everybody, for joining us for our Imola recap. We know that there's no race this weekend, and so in lieu of our favorite drivers racing, your favorite gals will be racing around a track. And by that, I mean these lovely ladies here, and I will be getting into some supercars and attempting our best F1 impressions out in the Chicago suburbs. And so we will be coming at you live this weekend with lots of videos and clips. We'll be recapping our attempts to be F1 drivers, and so hope you can join us next week to hear all about it.
So thanks for listening thus far. We love having you. If you want to follow us, we have an Instagram. It's grid.gals. Or hit us up on our TikTok. Or you can visit our website, which is linked to all of our socials, gridgals.com, and go ahead and drop us any suggestions you might have for any of our upcoming episodes.
And that's the checkered flag for this session. We'll see you back here on the grid next week.